All right, so this is take two on this FRQ. I just recorded it and it didn't save, so I'm gonna I'm gonna do my best here. Let's hope I don't skip anything over. Too obviously, I'm a little frustrated, but anyways, we'll bear with here. This FRQ isn't that bad. I know it looks long and it looks like there's a lot of parts into it. It's pretty straightforward. This part C here is where it gets tricky, but hopefully we can figure it out. It's slightly different than the way your book's been teaching it, so it's going to be a little confusing for some of us, but I think we'll be able to walk through it. Also, I want to point out too. I'll point out at the beginning here. This is from the 2016 AP exam. This is question number 2. So if you want, you can find the scoring guidelines online, and there are other teachers and other people who probably put resources up on this on their websites or YouTube videos. So you can find other sources for this if you don't like my explanation for it, or if you don't. If you're having trouble following me, there are other sources available. So, and we'll check back and make sure I did all my math right too, correctly here. Anyways, so let's just read the first bit here. We're going to go through all these questions individually, but we're going to read the first bit here so we understand just what we're looking at. So the following is a balance sheet of First Superior Bank. So only one bank we're looking at here. They have assets on one side and liabilities and equity on the others. This is a classic T chart for banks. You see this all the time. So $2,000 in demand deposits, zero equity. Why they even put that on there, who cares? Maybe just to throw us off. Over here, reserves, $200. Loans, $1,800. All right, cool. Assume the required reserve ratio is 10%, which is pretty standard. Like I said, you're going to see that a lot on AP exams. All right, so that's all we need to know right now. Let's look at question number A. What is the dollar value of new loans that First Superior Bank can make? Explain. Oh, okay, so it says explain, so we have to actually explain our answer. We're talking like 1 to 2 sentences here. Let me look at the scoring guideline here. Looks like one sentence they used in the scoring guideline. You might need more, that's fine, but they used one sentence, it looks like. All right, so okay, so right now they have $2,000 in demand deposits, but we know that the required reserve ratio is 10%, so they have to keep 10% of 2,000 set aside. Well, what's 10% of 2,000? $200. So how much are they keeping in their reserves right now? $200. How much of it now, do they have any excess reserves? And now you might look at loans and say, oh, that's excess reserves. It's not. It doesn't say loanable funds. It doesn't say excess reserves. It says loans. Right now, $1,800 is loaned out. This bank has loaned out $1,800 of the $2,000, which it has. It has loaned out $1,800. It's kept $200, the bare minimum required reserve. It's kept out that $200. And so how much money can they loan out to people? If you go into this bank right now and you say, "Hey, I need a loan," they're going to say, "Hey, we don't have any money." Which is not a good sign from your bank, right? You don't want your bank to ever say they don't have any cash. But because usually banks are trying to encourage spending and encourage GDP growth and grow the money supply essentially. So right now, though, if you go into this bank and ask for a new loan, they can make $0 in new loans. They have the bare minimum of their required reserves here, and all the rest of it is loaned out already. So right now they are loaned out. They are totally maxed out of loans. So hopefully that part you understand, and hopefully that part you can kind of grasp. Right now this bank can't make any new loans. But don't worry, Mr. Smith comes to the rescue. So Mr. Smith, new bank customer, he deposits $100 of cash into a demand deposit account at First Superior Bank. Calculate the maximum amount of new loans that First Superior Bank can now make. All right, this should be pretty straightforward. So what I would do if this was me and I had this piece of paper here and taking it as a paper test, whatever, I would probably either rewrite this T chart or I would scribble out these numbers here and write how they're going to change. So what's going to change? Well, let's look at this. $100 in a new demand deposit account. So demand deposits are going to increase by $2,100. $100. So it's going to be $2,100 up here. So 2,100. But then assets does not equal liabilities, right? So we have to figure out this problem here because these two things should be equal to each other. So this went up by $100, but you have to do some math trickery over here. Well, $100 goes into demand deposits. Let's think about how much of it the bank needs to save in their required reserves. 10% of $100 is $10. So $10 will be set aside as required reserves. So $10 will be set over here in required reserves. But if we take 10 from 100, how much money is now added to our money supply currently? How much money is going to be added to excess reserves? How much money will be new loanable funds? $90. All right, so hopefully you figured out $90. New required reserves will go up to 210. Demand deposits will go up to 2,100. And new loanable funds, excess reserves, will go up to $90. There's now $90 that exists and can be propagated. There's $90 that exists and will be able to be spent and encourage more growth and loans and deposits and so on and so forth. So yeah, $90. $90 is going to be added over here. $10 will be here. $100 will be here. I would do this. If this was me, I would either scribble these numbers out and write them in there, or I would make a brand new T-chart saying that required reserves are now this, loans haven't changed yet, excess reserves are now $90, that's loanable funds, excess reserves, and demand deposits are now $2,100. Once again, equity, why are you even there? All right. This is where it gets hard. As a result of Mr. Smith's $100 cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in each of the following in the banking system. Oh, so they're asking us to look at specific parts of the banking system. Now, don't confuse the initial deposit of $100 with excess reserves, with loans. All right? So they're asking us to look at loans, not initial deposit and all that stuff. Your book simplifies this part. They're asking you to get a little bit more specific now on the AP exam. So they want to know what this $90 is going to do. What's this $90 going to do? That's what they're asking right here for loans. What's this $90 going to do? Well, how can we possibly figure out the change over time in the banking system of $90? Well, you might have put pieces together already, but we could probably use the money multiplier, right? And we could figure out how this money is going to propagate and how this new money in the money supply is going to increase and spread and expand. So excess reserves are going to have the impact, not the initial deposit. And that $90, right, if we multiply it by the money multiplier, which, by the way, you should have this one locked in. 1 divided by 0.1 is 10, right? So 10 times 90 is going to be $90 in new loans. $90 in new loans. We're looking at just the loans here. What's the possibility of loans growing? So, because that money will be taken, put into another bank, and then moved around and moved around and moved around, and then it will eventually create $900 in new loans. So $90 of new excess reserves equal $900 in new loans. We're just multiplying that specifically. That's what they're asking us for. But then they're asking us also specifically, what about demand deposits? How are demand deposits going to multiply in the long run in the banking system? Well, let's look over here. Demand deposits changed by $100. That was the $100 cash deposit over here. So what's that going to do? Well, as money bounces around, bounces around, bounces around, bounces around, that's going to lead to $1,000 in new deposits, new demand deposits. We're just taking the multiplier and just trying to think about what triggers are they asking us here for? Loans and demand deposits. Loans and demand deposits. Once again, like I said, you can check your math here, check these out. This is what they're looking for here. Part C is probably where a lot of you are going to get stuck, because you're going to want to use the initial deposit and just say that's the only growth of the money supply. And in a simplified form, you sometimes see it that way. But they asked for loans specifically and demand deposits specifically. All right, moving on. As a result of Mr. Smith's $100 cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in the money supply. So, how is M1 growing because of that $100 cash deposit? Now remember, not all of that $100 is going to be excess reserves, loanable funds, right? It's not all money in the bank that the bank is then going to turn around immediately, because we have to consider that required reserve, right? So as a result of that $100 cash deposit, $90 of which is now loanable funds that is out in the economy and being put to use, the money supply is going to increase by the same amount as loanable funds, $900 growth in money supply. So they're asking you basically the same thing as how much the loans are increasing in this case. So it's the exact same question. How much is that money supply increasing? He made a $100 cash deposit, but not all of that money is out in the money supply, right? Not all that. Some of that money is kept away in vaults. So how much of that is out in the money supply? Well, that $90 is what's going to increase the money supply. That $90 is our trigger. And so just like our loans now go up by $90 or $900, so does the money supply, because that $90 is what the trigger is here, not the $100. And I know that can be a little weird because they are looking for a little bit more specifically here, but that's the answer they're looking for. All right, last question I think is actually pretty easy, and we've already talked about this. We're just now applying it. So provide one reason why the actual change in money supply can be smaller than the maximum change you identified in Part D. So in Part D, we said that the maximum amount of growth in the money supply is $900. But why might we not get $900? What if we only had $600 in money growth? And you're sitting there scratching your head like, why didn't it grow that way? I thought that $90 was created essentially for loans, and $90 then propagated and could grow up to $900 in money supply. Possible money, possible loanable funds. How is it that we didn't hit 900? Well, think about what could happen. We're using the money multiplier, right? The money multiplier assumes that the banks are keeping the minimum required amount, which is 10%. So 1 divided by 0.1. But did we say banks do that? In reality, American banks, on average, keep far more than the required reserve. Right? So if the bank keeps more money in the required reserves, then that means that the money supply is not going to do what? It's not going to grow as quickly, because that $90, what if instead of growing by $90, it only grew by, $50 or $40, right? The money supply is not growing as quickly if banks are holding on to more of it, if they're worried about the future or something, so they're keeping more in their required reserves. So that's one possible reason. If banks are keeping more than the required reserve, that you're not going to hit $900. And by the way, different banks might have different required reserve amounts. For themselves, the country might say 10%, but Bank A might say 20, Bank B might say 30 or whatever. And so that's going to change and move around. And let's think about another way. We're assuming that the money supply is growing as people take money from assets and move it to liabilities and bounce between these two things as we move between different banks. And that's all the examples I've given you so far, where people taking money from one bank and putting it into another, and then fractional reserve and fractional reserve and fractional reserve. But is that how the world actually works? Do we always just take our money and move it from bank to bank? Well, no, sometimes we don't. Another reason might be that people aren't spending money on investments and aren't putting money into the bank as demand deposit accounts and stuff. But what if they're buying goods and services? If you take a $90 loan out of the bank and then go and buy $90 worth of tacos, did the money supply increase? No, I mean that's spending multiplier. That's you're consuming way too many tacos, but that's a GDP thing. That's not a money growth thing. We're not doing fractional reserve anymore with that $90, and so it's not going to increase the money supply by $900. So that we're not going to hit that $900 mark because you bought too many tacos. So if you're buying goods and services, it's not multiplying the money. If banks are keeping more than required reserve, you're not multiplying the money. Let's see, what do they say? 1.0% the money supply can be smaller than the maximum change of it holds more banks. Or yeah. So either one of these would be fine. Holds more money, the banks hold more excess revenues. That's fine. Yep. That basically it. If public holds more money, you're not putting it into the bank. That's another way of saying it. All right. So hopefully this FRQ sort of made sense. If you got about half of those questions right, you're probably in a pretty good place, assuming that you don't embarrass yourself on the multiple choice on the exam. So hopefully you got at least half of those right. And now we can move on to section 4.5.